are barely enough for all the wisdom that is offered. So this morning we have Jana Bennett, who comes to us from Dayton, Ohio, where she is professor and chairperson in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Dayton. And she gives workshops and writes about disability and technology use and being single. Her most recent books include Singleness and the Church, a new Theology of Singleness. And she co-authored an award-winning book, Naming Our Sins, How Recognizing the 7 Deadly Vices Can Renew the Sacrament of Reconciliation. So we're delighted to have Jana with us, and I want to turn it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you all. I'm very pleased to be here, and I want especially to thank Jeremy Klein and the planning committee for the invitation. Like many of you, I've been anticipating this conference for 4 years, and it's just a delight to be here finally after 2 years of the pandemic. And it's just been a lovely, hospitable, and generous place to be, so I hope you all are finding that as well. The title of my talk, as you can see, is Religion, Disability, and Embodiment in a Virtual World. And this is a much different title than I would have given 2 years ago if the pandemic had not occurred. But not only that, if certain political events had not occurred. Is the microphone?
It's perfect.
Okay. Moving the flower. Yeah. Thank you. And sitting next to me, who was not introduced, is my hearing ear dog, Duffy, who may get up and down as she feels like spinning. Or anyway, due to the pandemic, due to certain political events, I think that the way I think about technologies and also disabilities has changed a bit. And so I think that this is despite the fact that our lives have become much more impacted by technology and disability in the past 2 years. How we think and how we act on our uses of technology and our dealing with disability have not changed as much as I would like, as I think would be good for us as a society. And I think the basic difficulty is that we as chaplains and educators and broadly in society are not expansive enough in how we think about both of those terms. It is a problem, for example, if we do not automatically think about disability when we are thinking about technology. But that is just one problem among many that I hope to get to in my talk. In not thinking more expansively about both technologies and disabilities, we are keeping ourselves from learning how to respond well to others in crisis, and we are losing, I worry most, we are losing a sense of compassion, including and especially in higher education. By the end of this address, I hope to have shown that while becoming more expansive in our thinking might not yield necessarily bold, immediate action, it will provide the ground for compassionate and humane action throughout and continuing. So I imagine this paper in 4 parts. Parts 1 and 2 will situate the terms disability and technology. And I will take each term in turn to show how the current uses of these terms, especially in our speaking, but occasionally in our acting, tend to operate in either-or dichotomous kind of thinking, which I will try to show as well, tend to be exclusionary and unhelpful. I will go on to suggest why and how we need to be much more expansive in our understanding. And then in the third part of the paper, I will show how disability and technology intersect with each other in both helpful and unhelpful ways, especially when thinking about religion. And finally, in the fourth, I think fairly brief part, I'll propose a couple of practical ideas for going forward, but I hope that those ideas that I have will simply spark more conversation, and more creative thought. So, part one. First, I want to say something about my use of the word technology. I think technology is a very broad term, but generally what I'm speaking about today is the kind of technologies that are most typically used in higher education by our students, by us, and those include apps for obtaining goods and services, social media like TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, online course learning platforms like Blackboard and Sakai, and video platforms. Many people's uses of technology and experience with technology in the past 2 years has been to see it as being more integrated into human life. And we've in fact seen that at this conference already. Last night, with both the live stream and then the recorded Zoom, we've already encountered that integrated technology. When we think about our campuses prior to the pandemic, it might have been very different. I think about my own campus, for example, where there were no mobile food ordering apps. Multiple faculty and students did not use course software. Campus ministry was only available via face-to-face and email, maybe occasionally Twitter. But today, students and faculty and staff alike are using mobile orders to order a cafeteria lunch as they walk to their next class. And they might choose to go to a worship service via live stream before attending a meeting of a student club face-to-face. So there's a lot of interaction and intermingling. And what my campus is seeing is very much what research is showing in research that's being done in such diverse places as the Philippines and Ghana, is showing that kind of intermingling of our uses of social media. So while technology's current greater integration into daily life may be a fact of life, it is fraught with numerous ethical concerns. Our language about technology and our active engagement in technology remains, I think, in a kind of yes, no, good versus bad realm. And some of that is because of very, very real ethical concerns that we have to think about and deal with, including things like lack of network accessibility, lack of experience in teaching and learning and using online apps, learning that is less than optimal in some subject areas when it is brought online, isolation of using only online applications, and then there were other things during the pandemic that showed up, such as home environments that prevented good classroom use, adverse mental health effects, and much more. In other words, though, what that pandemic experience has fueled is a lot of conversation in the research about social media being deemed largely negative, even as we continue to use social media in exactly the integrated ways that we've already seen at this conference. So it gets in research, it gets especially associated with decline in mental health. You can see some of the news stories that I pulled here on this slide include things about student responses to online learning as being not suboptimal, the sense that people don't care. There's very much a kind of yes and no and mostly negative kind of aspect of thinking about digital learning and digital technology. And you can see that among the students on my campus. As my campus has begun to return to pre-pandemic activities, there's been a kind of sigh of relief, a kind of, oh good, we can have food at our activities again, no masks, not only moving away from digital technology, but completely preventing it in certain kinds of spaces. Now, this sense of the good versus the bad very much coincides with the particular place in which we are in terms of technology uses and political polarization this is especially in the US, I think, in my own context, but I believe looking at the ways technology uses are discussed across the world, it looks like it seems to be in several societies, not all, as I'll get to later on, but in several societies, people are very concerned about the way and blame social media for the kind of polarization, the kind of political unrest that we've been seeing. So, for example, in the news that I have here, I have several news slides that suggest that the ways that technology can be fueling polarized society, and not only that, kind of the insurrection of 2020 and Donald Trump's attempted takeover of democratic processes has been blamed in part on social media that silos people into groups. There may be perhaps similar kind of silos that are being blamed on social media throughout in other parts of the world. So there are commenters that suggest that social media fuels much that is wrong. A possible timeline for the way that social media begins to negatively impact social media use is all the way back in 2013, when a most popular social media platform switched from being places, and I'm thinking specifically here of Facebook and Twitter, switched from being places where people were merely sharing photographs and maybe key information like congratulations for graduating or getting a grade on a test or that kind of thing. Those sorts of messages, they switched because the social media platform added a particular thing, and that was the like button. And all of a sudden what we had was a kind of capitalist, how many likes can I amass? How many, you get a kind of a storm of people wanting more friends, wanting those likes, and that definitely fueled a kind of the way that that Facebook and Twitter and other social media apps became monetized. And so there was a kind of popularity sense that went right along with getting paid in money. And so that obsession with going viral yielded what some commentators might call a world that encourages dishonesty and mob dynamic. Users were guided not just by true preferences, but by their experiences of reward and punishment. The platforms were almost perfectly designed to bring out our most moralistic and least reflective selves. In other words, the culture of outrage, right? The kind of think that everything I post is going to be something that sparks not only interest, but like the pinnacle of interest so that I can get more likes. So you have this kind of culture of outrage and constant outrage, and this kind of sense of what's going to be the next moment of outrage that I can that I can grab and then monetize. So constant outrage became so commonplace such that now people have more and more difficulty comprehending other people's points of view. Commentators like Jonathan Haidt, for example, therefore believe that democracy itself is in trouble and that social media as an entity spreading disinformation and eroding institutional trust is evil. Scholars further argue that higher education itself is hurt by these political silos because those viewpoints find themselves their ways into our universities, and also because they lack both truth and the ability to see multiple viewpoints from multiple people. Some suggest especially that the lack of multiple voices present in online conversation is the thing that is yielding the greater mental health problems that we see in our students. A rise which is precisely what we are seeing on campuses all over the world. While scholars might acknowledge that social media has provided voices for the voiceless, especially and therefore might occasionally be good, especially in something like the Me Too movement. And it is also giving space for socialization during the pandemic. By and large, again, the way we speak about social media is seen as being almost entirely bad. It is very understandable. I think there's some truth to all of this. And I think it is very understandable that given these points, people would be arguing exactly that our virtual life is bad. Often the more positive forces, the relationships that people are able to kindle or maintain online, the online communities, including worshiping communities that have been instrumental in supporting people over the years, well prior to the pandemic, the real theological arguments that can be had online, those aspects are largely being overlooked in contemporary discourse. Now, I want to step back a little bit, because what I presented is the situation as I see it in 2022. But I want to suggest to you and indicate to you that the good, bad, moral language about our technology use has a relatively long history. When I first started writing about digital theology in 2012, in my book, Aquinas on the Web, theologians were still very much arguing about whether technology was merely a neutral tool to use, or a positive force for good, or a complete evil. At the time, I rejected all three categories to argue that online life is really about a holistic digital culture. And if it's a digital culture, then there's a certain responsibility that each one of us has for participating in and maintaining that culture. At the time, I argued that being online was a way of life distinctive from offline life, but that offline and online life were necessarily intertwined and shared multiple similar features. For example, I found that theological conversation happened in both online and offline contexts, and that the two modes influence each other. While there were other digital scholars who joined me in declaring that there was something different going on with social media, the good, evil, neutral debate continued to exist and really just spins into the kind of conversation that we're having today. However, if it is the case that we simply are living online and offline life in intersecting ways, I mean, how many of you last night at dinner perhaps might have pulled out your phone while you're having a face-to-face conversation so that you look up something on Google? But I mean, I think there's a lot of people who do that kind of seamless interaction on their day-to-day life. So if I were to update my 2012 book, what I would simply say is there isn't even a digital culture so much as simply human life in which online conversation, work, and play happen in intersecting ways while being face-to-face. So I think students had already recognized this seamlessness. I think that for many people, especially at least on my campus, it was really when Zoom turned overnight into the kind of only way that we could connect with people, that kind of seamlessness happened. And now we can see it in the technology, where early on in the pandemic, people were like, I have no idea how to use Zoom. Now, you know, if I set up a meeting, people will say, oh, shall we do it by Zoom? Or shall I come over to your office? Right? And it will very much depend on the situation. So for some houses of worship, Zoom also became the way that we began to pray and sing and more, or at least try to find connection. So I was very interested in the presence of online theaters, which made the news at least in Dayton, Ohio. In the way that people are trying to pull in traditions and make use of religious traditions while maintaining both online and offline life. To go further from that, this kind of integration of technology isn't just something that has happened, I want to argue, in the last couple of years, even though I think for social media it is. I think that our technologies have also been integrating with us and through us since our beginning. Part of what it means to be human is to be people who use technology and develop technology. So for example, we develop things like spheres and doorknobs and pencils, none of which we probably think about technology as technology, but all of which are, in a certain kind of way, and especially for theologians of technology like myself, technologies. They are all technology. And so, in my Christian tradition, I would name that first blessing that God gives to humans in Genesis, to have stewardship or dominion over the earth and to subdue it as part of that blessing of using the earth and naming that we are people who use technology, develop technology, and that's part of what it means to be, simply to be human. With our technologies, we simply do live this life. Now, the second piece of that is our technologies are also remain virtual and have been virtual for, I would say, thousands of years. Virtuality itself is also not new. So people have been trying to find ways to remain with each other even while we are separated for thousands of years. And you can see that in religious life. Digital theologian Catherine Schmidt has noted this especially. For example, she gives, I think, what you may be familiar with this example, but it's a common example of the way that people did pilgrimages in the Middle Ages. So, for example, a pilgrimage was seen, especially to the Holy Land, as a good thing, as an important thing. But most people did not have the money, did not have the time, did not have the means to take that kind of long travel. And so, one of the suggestions, this is I think perhaps debated in medieval theology, but I think there's a connection here, is that you can see a connection between, say, the maps of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, which are on the top here in the colors, and then the ways in which the labyrinth at Chartres Cathedral is divided and portioned out. And there's definitely seemed to be this connection between taking the trip to the Holy Land, the map of the Holy Land, and taking a trip to the Holy Land via the labyrinth that is on the floor in the cathedral. And there would be other places where labyrinths would be created as well. So that the labyrinth itself, which can be created in a floor space like this, that you could go to the Holy Land virtually via the labyrinth. This would be just one among many kind of examples, I think. But I think if you look at the way the map is divided, I mean, it's clearly a medieval map. It's not actually a map of the Holy Land in the way that we would think of maps. But you can see that it's divided into 4 quarters, and I hope you can see that. And then the lines, if you look at the labyrinth in the middle there, the lines are drawn somewhat similarly. And so the labyrinth is around the same kind of line. Now, like I said, this isn't the only kind of example. We also have examples of Catherine Schmidt, that digital theologian who suggests this, also suggests that the letters from Paul to early churches are examples of virtuality, because he wants to be with the community in person, but he is not able to be with the community in person, so he writes a letter. The letter is treated as if he were there himself. And in fact, it is so much so that it eventually becomes part of the canonical text in the Christian tradition. So human seamless incorporation of both virtuality and technology is therefore long-standing. In saying that this seamless culture exists, I am not trying to say that our social media and other technologies are neutral. I'm not going back to that good versus bad versus neutral kind of dichotomy. What I want to say, though, is that it is not well for us to dichotomize our online and offline life in good and bad categories in the ways that we've been doing. There are several reasons for that, some of which I mentioned here. One of them is that it's simply too simplistic. It gives over our moral agency as human beings to those who make technologies or to the business interests, maybe more properly speaking, that make those technologies. And therefore we begin to narrow our vision on what our possible actions and responses can be to people. We begin to think that the only possible response is usually some kind of technological response. A different way to think about this is by using the word technocracy, which is a common word for theologians of disability and for philosophers of disability, of technology, sorry. But it's also a common word that made its way into the papal encyclical that Francis wrote in 2015, Laudacity. Technocracy is the idea that technology connected to business interests is presented as the only way of solving our human problems, or maybe even as a majority way of solving our human problems. And the difficulty is that it overlooks, it kind of becomes too broad of a brush. It overlooks our connections with each other, our relationships, the kind of that mysterious network of relations. Solving a problem via tech developed by people who make money off that development. That's sort of the technocracy kind of problem. So I think our response then has to be much more expansive and creative. If we wish to help ourselves and others who are suffering from bullying and mental health concerns, but we also find in our smartphones chances to be community for each other, then we need to learn how to build our relationships in better ways. To provide a contrast to some of the earlier people that I mentioned who were seeing social media as the root of all evil, I want to therefore give a different kind of contrast. A sociologist, Brendan Nyhan, argues that the data for connections between declines in democracy and the rise of certain forms of social media aren't clear. There are certainly correlations, but as we know, correlation in finding the cause isn't always easy to figure out. So for example, someone did a study in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the same study that was done in America, and the study that was done in America showed mass polarization along political lines. The study that was done in Bosnia and Herzegovina found precisely the opposite, that people who stayed on Facebook were, by the end of the study, more positively disposed to the historical outgroups. And the author's interpretation was that ethnic groups that have so little contact with each other in Bosnia were able to forge some of those connections online. So the upshot of this is that I think what we will need is that creative response, by which I mean we need to be able to begin to see our situation better and with more nuance and detail, and then respond to each of the situations in which we live in much more specific detail. So I'll return to that a little bit later on. I want to turn now to the dichotomizing disability piece, because I think there's some similar kind of things that are going on there. Disability, like technology, has been at the risk of all too narrow dichotomous visions. The standard ways that people talk about disability, it seems that, first of all, what counts as disability is very clear. Often, at least when I first talk to people, they'll say, oh, it's basically physical disabilities that people can see. And so many people, because people know that I'm a disability activist, many people come up to me and complain like, oh, that person over there parked in a parking space that is reserved for people with disabilities, and they don't look like they have a disability. The difficulty is that, so the default thinking is that disability is highly visible. It has to be wheelchairs, or people who can't walk or talk quite rightly, people with service dogs, that kind of thing. Disability seems therefore to be very much a case of us normal people versus them, the highly visible disabled people. Yet as disability theologian Deborah Coomer reminds us, what it means to be disabled will depend very much on perspective. As with our technologies, there is no neat and simple division for disability. Medical and educational professionals will often define disability in terms of what a person can or cannot physically or functionally do. At its best, the medical professional definition of disability enables people to alleviate pain and aid in healing. At its worst, however, a medical model of disability constantly seeks to fix disability by making disabled people so-called as normal as possible, which then makes it feel like, begins to make it feel like all humans must be in some kind of ideal mode. A related definition, close to many religious communities, is a charity model of disability, which also seeks to alleviate pain and suffering by bestowing kind of pity and charity on people with disabilities. Still, a different definition of disability makes a distinction between an impairment, which means my body is different from yours, and disability. Just because I have an impairment does not make me disabled. I am not disabled until I encounter some disabling aspect of society. So this is known as the social model of disability. For example, if a building does not have a flashing light smoke detector, I will be disabled relative to those who can hear the sound of the smoke detector. Or as another example, I can almost never hear a homily in a church building because the sound systems are incompatible. So I am disabled. These definitions of disability, the medical and social model, can be helpful, but they also each perpetuate an us versus a them, a clear divide between the people who are normal and the people who are not. As with the good and bad versus bad, the technology divide I described a moment ago, the us versus them divide in disability is fraught with moral problems. One is that we run the grave risk of overlooking people who need help and compassion. The truth is, I am not at all disturbed by those who park in disabled parking spots that don't look disabled, because in fact most disabilities are invisible. Moreover, even those disabilities that seem obvious can be hidden from view. People do not necessarily know that I have a hearing loss when they meet me. Third, because of the us versus them dichotomy, and the shame associated with disability, there's a kind of seems to be kind of a social imperative to hide one's disability. Many of our cultures emphasize and prize autonomy and independence, and disabilities impinge on that vision. Since disabilities show dependence rather than independence. Those of us working in higher education know acutely about invisible disabilities and the shame associated with them, precisely because of the rise in mental health concerns in the past few years. Mental health, cognitive disabilities, and even most physical disabilities are not visible, but they are very real and present. The pandemic has shown that being able-bodied is only a temporary condition. At the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote an essay about the ways in which I hoped the pandemic would compel us to respond to people with disabilities with greater wholeness, because most of the people who are at risk for COVID, in the pre-vaccine world, therefore most of the people at risk of dying, were the majority, at least the majority of American adults, and I think that may be the case in multiple other societies, because the risk factors included things like diabetes and obesity, which have include very large populations. What I hoped is that recognizing that point might make us compassionate towards more people and might make us respond to each other with greater patience and compassion. Might we all begin to slow down and recognize that we are dependent on each other. Yet, as the pandemic wore on, I was disappointed and angered to find that that's not what happened, and that instead what was happening was a continued further divide, so that, at least in the US, we had the mask debate, where people were saying, oh, if you need a mask, because you are immunocompromised or at risk for COVID, then go over there into that room, stay in your housing, remain isolated, make use of those social technologies that we think may be fueling your isolation in some cases. Don't bother to come here. As with technologies, there was that narrowing of understanding of disability, that truncating vision of how to respond to others. And so I believe we are at a moment, and an emergency moment, in fact, where we need to act with nimbleness and agility, and we need to learn to make more varied and creative responses toward people with disabilities, as well as toward our technology. So now let's take a look at how those intertwine. The two are actually inseparable. We would not have some of our technologies without people with disabilities. And I will just use the one I'm most familiar with, which is hearing loss. We would not have a smartphone without technology, because the phone itself was created as a kind of a disability accommodation for people with hearing loss back in the 19th century. And texting technology was itself developed originally for people who are deaf to be able to communicate. It was a takeoff of the TTY phone. So SMS was directly connected to TTY. But at the same time, of course, we can name that the relationship between technology, while it has that positive and clear connection, also contains tension, because many of those same technologies seem to aim toward an ultimate end of eradicating disability. So I have here another example from my own disability, the cochlear implant, which is the box on the right-hand side. In the medical community, these are seen as the kind of miracle fix for people with disabilities. But from the perspective of a person with hearing loss, cochlear implants do not really fix anything. In fact, in order to get one, you have to destroy any residual hearing that you have, so that if the technology does not work, you also no longer have your hearing, any of your natural hearing remaining. So it can be a real tragedy. In addition, cochlear implants often seem directed towards the deaf community, which sees itself as its own culture and its own right. And so it seems to be eradicating or desiring to eradicate people with deafness. There are other technologies that would provide an example for this, especially in relation to gene modification. So people with dwarfism or other kinds of genetically linked disabilities often worry, and part of their activism is centered on if you modify genes, then you're eradicating people like me. And then what does that say about our culture? There's, of course, that's a whole can of worms that we could open and talk about in a much longer paper. What I want to say as the upshot is that the intertwining of disability and technology is clear and present, and should serve to emphasize what I indicated in my first two parts, which is that we cannot have these dichotomies operating. We need to instead to have much more of a nuance and creativity, and add that to the way we operate. We cannot feed solving our problems to algorithms. So again, thinking about that idea of technocracy, when we fail to acknowledge as part of reality the worth of a person with disabilities, it becomes difficult to hear the cry of nature itself. Everything is connected. Once the human being declares independence from reality and behaves with absolute dominion, the very foundations of our life begin to crumble. And so our reality is intersecting technology and disability. The question must become then how we become more adept at using practical wisdom to think through when and how we will respond to human beings and to each other, using both technology and thinking about disability. I'll give one example from my parish, which is right here. We had we switched to live stream instantaneously at the beginning of the pandemic and kept using it for about a year and a half. And then when the time came when the priest said, well, we need to stop using live stream technology, everybody come back, because face-to-face worship is better. there was a huge outcry because it turned out that many people who had not been able to attend church for years were able to come via live stream. And that wasn't only because of the pandemic. That was the people who were shut in before, that was people who were cognitively disabled, and many more people. So, the priest made an apology, brought back the live stream pretty much within 3 days, and so it remained as a regular part of our worship alongside the face-to-face. Now, the creative response cannot stop there, because you cannot say it is solved with that algorithm, with that technology. The problem is not solved. Now we also know that there are people who are out there before who are not being reached and need to have some face-to-face visits, maybe need to ensure their participation in our society. And so, just quickly because I know at time, I just want to suggest a couple of practices that we might think about, because our what I think is incumbent upon us is to consider then, like, how are we going to do this nuance and creativity, basically? And I think what is incumbent on us is to make sure that we are being very deliberate about how we use our technologies and how we think about people with disabilities. And we're going to need to do that, and how we become more inclusive, much more broadly speaking. And we're going to need to do that by thinking about how our practices can create a habit that enables us to begin to see the world in this more nuanced and creative way, rather than that split-second continuous thought of, oh, our technology will save us. Or, oh, them, we just chunked them over here into this, isolated box. So I suggest perhaps prayer. On the right-hand side, we have a prayer app that is an online prayer app, but that is then connected to a community of people that are connected, that can talk to each other in real time. So it's not just an isolating kind of, I do my prayer on my own. On the other side, what we have is for the festival, and this was from an online community group that was talking about how do we become more accessible for people with disabilities. So it was the online group that was helping us think about how do we do things face-to-face in terms of prayer. That's just a couple of examples. The other example I had was contemplation. But I would love for you all and for all of us to think now more about those creative responses to our technologies and disabilities. Thank you very much.
If you have questions, raise your hand. The mic is warming up, but by the time I get to you, it'll probably be ready.
I'm Kate, pronouns she, her, and I live in Oxford. I was reflecting on what you were saying about churches being more accessible in their practice. Are there things we can do to be more accessible in our preaching, our language, our practical theology that would integrate our practice and our speech?
Yes, so one thing that I shared I did a workshop yesterday on disability and inclusiveness, and I would be very happy to share that with the leadership. That's the handout that I gave, which is an accessibility audit that you can use for your ministry spaces, whatever they may be, to think about things like, how do we become more accessible? One of them is certainly can be by to bring the technology and disability piece together. Put your sermons online and make sure that they're there. I mean, if you can, I realize that's a difficulty, but make sure that if you can, give people who you know to be deaf a copy of the written language before you're there. Make sure captions are working on any technology you use. But thinking about vision impairment, you would like to make sure that any video, you have audio description of the visible spaces that you're using. Those are just a couple of them. Obviously, there's multiple mobility, accessibility issues, and multiple ways to think about cognitive impairment where we might become much more accessible. And those could use both that combination of technology and other things we might not consider technology, although they are. But I'll share that handout.
Other question?
Hello, my name's Fiona and I'm a chaplain in Hatfield at the university there. I've been in a Twitter debate on language used in services around accessibility, and there are points in the service where we ask people to stand, and I'm now more confused than ever as to what I should actually say, because I don't want to ask people to stand if it's not possible for them.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say, would you like to stand, because the person might want to stand but is not able to stand, and is the word able wrong there?
Right, yeah, that's a difficult thing, as is pretty much, I mean, there's a lot of things that are in religious language especially that ask us to, you know, hear like the deaf, may the deaf hear like the hearing, or may the blind see, the lame leap for joy, that kind of language. And this is a kind of a similar kind of example. I mean, I think you do the best you can. So you recognize that the issue is there, but I think the giving of hospitality is the openness to hospitality is maybe the most important thing, because I think my main idea about disability is that there's a way in which we are, everybody in this room either has a disability or is temporarily able-bodied. And so, we're kind of all in the same boat. And so once you think in those terms, I think being the most hospitable possible is probably the best way to go. I mean, I think a please stand as you are able could work, but there might be other kinds of things. And one thing to consider is that you may end up wanting to do a couple of different types of things. One where there's clearly standing, one where you're trying some other postures. So that could be another way too. Again, that's that expansive kind of creative thinking sort of thing. There might be other ways to think about what you're doing. And also always giving that kind of online mode can also invite people to be there who wouldn't feel comfortable with standing, but who might feel comfortable being present in an online way.
We have time for just one more question, so we've got one back here.
Hi there. I was wondering, I'm familiar with the Abrahamic religions especially, and in a lot of the scripture, there's, disability is a very central part of it and I hadn't thought about that before this lecture. So if you think about a lot of the prophets in the Bible and in the Quranic stories, they have disabilities, they're blind. Obviously the story of Job, that's the same in Islam as well. I'm wondering, why is it that as religious people we see those figures who are disabled in our core scriptures as included in the narrative, whereas nowadays we've kind of got this divide where we see people with more obvious disabilities, physical disabilities, as apart and separate from the narrative? And does it have something to do with modernity and the way it's made us think about things?
So I read lips, and I'm not sure if I caught the question very well. So let me just see. So your question is something about there seems to be in many religious traditions a kind of friendliness toward disability, but why is it that now we have this divide and we support this divide? Is that sum it up sort of? Okay. Yeah. I think there's a lot of potential reasons for that. ones that I would tend to point to is a philosophical shift, that maybe set of shifts that we made, especially in Western culture, but of course impacting multiple cultures around the world, with the European Enlightenment, but then also the Industrial Revolution, both of which began idealizing a certain form of the body that didn't take into account that people are different. So I think that kind of, merged in unhelpful ways with religious practice. But there might be other reasons that I'm not aware of, so I'd be happy for more conversation.
Okay, we are now at time, and the next thing we're going to is coffee.
It is indeed. Perhaps I'll just say thank you, Jana. Can we say thank you to Jana?